بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Well, what was so interesting is that when they really studied and analyzed these qualities, the one quality that stood out the most, more than anything else, was called follow through. Meaning what? Meaning that these students, regardless of what economic background they came from, regardless of what their interests were, regardless of what they wanted to do for a living, what resources were provided for them, the ones who succeeded the most, that quality or that factor was follow through, meaning that when they committed to something, they didn't give it up. So if they, for instance, during their high school years had committed to playing a certain sport, they didn't quit. They didn't give up. The ones that followed through on their commitments, no matter how challenging it was, were the most successful out of this group of people that were studied, these students that were studied. So think about that. Follow through. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like what the Quran tells us? وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. And those that to what they are safeguarded with and their contracts and vows, they honor them and follow through with them. وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَضَى نَحْبَهُ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَنْتَظِرُ. That's also in chapter 33, the verse that I mentioned. Those who have fulfilled their vows. It's no wonder that the Quran talks about success and joy and happiness within those terms, the terms of fulfilling your contracts. So going back to that original subject, learning follow through the camp of Imam Hussainع alayhi salam. What I want to look at throughout the rest of this talk is how do we lead, how do we teach, how do we inspire a sense of commitment and then follow through with that commitment at a time where things are shaky, at a time where things are unknown, at a time where it becomes easy and sometimes encouraged to walk away from the things that you are supposed to commit to and then follow through with. Well, there are 3 areas and 3 suggestions, and of course there are many more, but in this lecture I only want to talk about 3. Number 1, and this is important, brothers and sisters, is that we have to learn how to eliminate the concept and language of shame. But here's the caveat, here's the catch. As it relates to the concept of perfection or perfectionism. I'll repeat that again. When it comes to the idea of perfection or perfectionism, we need to eliminate the language and culture of shame. What does that mean? Well, when you look at environments where people are expected to be perfect, where people are expected to be flawless. And by the way, when I say this, you might be thinking, well, nobody expects anybody to be perfect. Nobody expects anybody to be flawless. In our minds, we may think that way, but what does our behavior say about the way that we think? A lot of the times you'll find spouses, they might say, well, I don't expect you to be perfect, but with their behavior, they expect one another to be perfect. Parents will do the same for children. Teachers will do the same for students, and vice versa. There's no such thing as perfection and perfectionism. And when you see perfection, there usually is shame right there. There's an author who actually writes about shame, and her name is Brené Brown. She's written a number of books on the subject. And she recently said that whenever you see perfection or perfectionism at the wheel, shame is usually there riding in the passenger seat, and fear is in the back seat. Those are concepts that are related to one another. So we need to get rid of the language and the culture of shame as it relates to perfectionism. And that's the catch. Not that we become shameless, not that we become careless. In fact, the Quran says the exact opposite. The Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and this is in chapter 3, verse 135, وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً أَوْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ ذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ فَاسْتَغْفَرُوا لِذُنُوبِهِمْ. And those who, the believers, when they commit a shameless act, fahisha, when they commit a shameless act, or they do wrong to themselves, and that's another way of saying they engage in an act of disobedience, they remember God. And then they ask for forgiveness. وَمَنْ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. And who else forgives the sins and acts of disobedience except for God? They remember God. Why? Because as soon as we conduct a shameless act, the shaitan comes and he whispers, and he makes us feel ashamed. And when we feel ashamed, we feel unworthy. We feel imposter syndrome. We feel that I can't turn back to God. And he tells us all sorts of things like, you just committed the most shameless act. You can't turn back to God. God is not going to listen to you. It's at that time, my friends, that we need to turn to God. Why? Because the Quran says, وَمَنْ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. If you're feeling shame and you turn away from God, who are you going to turn to? The only person that can help you in that situation is God. وَمَنْ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. So I'm not saying become shameless. I'm not saying become careless, but as it relates to the concept of perfectionism, you find that a lot of the times, the reason why people use the language of shame is because they expect others to be perfect. And we use shame for ourselves as well, against ourselves. But the reality is, my friends, is that if we shame ourselves and others, and if we expect ourselves to be perfect and others to be perfect, that becomes one of the biggest barriers in following through with our commitments. You can't. Because no matter what happens, you're not good enough. And so you stop. You stop honoring your commitments. You stop following through. So that's one barrier when it comes to follow through. And the greatest example that we have is the lives of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Many of you have heard the story, you teach your children the story of how the Imams Al-Hasan and Al-Hussain alayhimus salam, when they were young, how they found a man who was not performing the wudu properly. And how instead of walking up to him and shaming him for being a grown man who didn't know, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've come across people of all ages who, they're afraid to approach someone, a scholar, or they're afraid to approach an elder, or they're afraid to approach people in order to teach them how to perform the wudu, because in their mind, they're thinking, well, I'm 25, I'm 30, I'm 45, I'm 50, I should already know this. And so if I ask someone to shadow me and to correct me if I make a mistake, I'm gonna, that person's gonna shame me, and I don't want to feel this feeling of shame. So instead of doing that, what the two young men did was that they modeled for one another in front of this man how to perform the wudu. And so one of them intentionally made a mistake and the other one corrected him, and they were able to do that in view of the man. See how subtle their treatment was? Instead of shaming him, they found a way to teach a lesson, not ignore it, to teach a lesson, but not to expect perfection from people. And a lot of the times when we expect perfection from people, we're willing to shame them. When we expect perfection from ourselves, we're also willing to shame ourselves. That author says that perfection, it's like this shield that we carry around because we try to protect ourselves from criticism, from hurt, from frustration, from failure. And we feel like if we just get perfect at something, there's not going to be any more pain. There's not going to be any more struggle. There's not going to be a challenge to go against. When we all know how ridiculous that actually sounds. You don't get to a point in life where there's no pain at all. What we see on social media with people who project success, material wealth, and all of that, we don't know sometimes the type of, we don't recognize the type of pain that they're feeling on the inside. So Al-Imam Abi Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam was also very subtle in his ways with people. We have many stories, and we'll recount some of these stories in the next few nights, of how he would embrace people. He would love people. Even if they had the worst past, he did not judge them for their past. He embraced them and brought them in. Some people like Al-Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi, who was a noble man, but he had made some of the wrong choices. The Imam embraced him. Other people that joined the camp of the Imam, he embraced them with no shame, with no judgment at all. So one way that we lead and inspire and teach the concept of following through with commitments is that we need to remove shame and perfectionism out of the equation. If we shame our children and we expect them to be perfect, then they won't want to follow through. They'll see obstacles in their way. They won't see opportunities in their way. If we do the same for our spouses, then we won't be encouraging them to follow through. If we do the same for our students, we won't be encouraging them to follow through. So this is one area. One is eliminating perfectionism and the concept of shame, ridding ourselves from that.